Good evening. Good evening. My name is Kate James. I am the executive director at Concord Art. Um, it's really wonderful to see so many familiar faces out there. And for all the unfamiliar faces, please come in and introduce yourself. I'd love to see you now that we're seeing people in person at Concord Art. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to be back and to have these great shows and to be able to talk um, and reminisce. It's incredible to imagine that 100 years ago, we were just out of a horrible world war and we're on the back end of a pandemic. These are circumstances that sadly reflect what we see today. And as we did then, so we do now, our hearts go out to those citizens of Ukraine. I think we all have been watching the news and their wonderful president every night, and to all who've suffered as a result of the pandemic. I want to thank you all for tuning in. We are thrilled by the enormous interest in tonight's subject, women artists practicing in the Boston area 100 years ago. And since I brought up 100 years ago twice now, I'll let you in on this preoccupation of mine. As many of you know, Concord Art is 100 years old this year. And now that we are 3 months into our centennial year, we have learned just how rich and rewarding historical context is and how that history steers Concord Art to this day. Our story really starts with the artist Elizabeth Wentworth Roberts, who staged and curated her first exhibitions in the Concord townhouse years before she purchased and renovated our current location in 1922 at 37 Lexington Road. This month, I have been lucky enough to immerse myself in that history, leading tours of our current Elizabeth Wentworth Roberts exhibition as part of Concord's celebration of Women's History Month. And during these tours, I have heard the same questions repeated over and over. What was it like to be a woman artist 100 years ago? And she's such an incredible artist. Why haven't I ever heard of her? The answers to those questions we all know are not simple. I'm hoping that our lecture tonight may be able to shed some light on what it was like for women artists at the turn of the century. So, hence, welcome to Concord Art's Centennial Celebration Lecture. We will be celebrating at Concord Art all year with our rotating Elizabeth Wentworth Roberts show, as well as curated shows that draw from her favorite themes. The exhibition's opening on March 31st will focus on one of her and Concord's most beloved subjects, trees. I'd like to thank programs manager Marissa Cote and events co-chair Kate Kaplan for engaging our esteemed, popular, and very busy lecturer, Erica Hirshler. Erica is the Kroll Senior Curator of American Paintings at the MFA Boston and an expert in late 19th and early 20th century American painting. Dr. Hirshler has published extensively on John Singer Sargent, Hyman Bloom, Mary Cassatt, Child Hassam, Dennis Bunker, William Merritt Chase, Winslow Homer, and women artists and collectors. She is particularly interested in the vibrant artistic exchange between the United States and Europe in issues of national identity and in opportunities available to women during this period. She also studies Boston history, art, and patronage. She holds a BA from Wellesley and an MA and Ph.D. from BU, and serves on the board of directors for the Terra Foundation of American Art. Her next show, an interdisciplinary project exploring John Singer Sargent, fashion, and the construction of identity, will open in the fall of 23 and will travel to Tate, Britain in the spring of 24. If you have questions during this lecture, please write them into the chat, and Marissa will lead a Q&A following Erica's program. And please join me in welcoming Erica Hirshler, our speaker tonight. We're so excited to hear from her. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I'm thrilled to be joining you, at least virtually. I'd much rather be in person. I have to tell you, it's a little weird to give a lecture sitting alone at home in your living room, but I'll do my best. I want to start by saying thank you to Marissa, to Kate, and to Natalie, who have done so much to make this evening run so smoothly. And I want to give a special thanks to Elizabeth Roberts, the founder of the Art Association and the subject of the current exhibition that Kate just mentioned. You see her here on the right and one of her paintings of Concord from 1919 on the left. Roberts was one of many talented women artists who were active in Boston during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And this evening we'll look together at those accomplishments. As the art critic William Howe Downs commented in 1896, and I quote, "Every year we see more and more of these sisters of the brush and palette coming forward as doughty competitors to the men, and nowhere do they threaten more serious rivalry than in Boston, where the democracy of art regards neither sex nor previous condition of servitude." Well, it took some time, I think, for women to prove that their work could be serious art and that they could be working as professionals and that their work could take place outside the home. Now, we all know that saying, a man may work from sun to sun, but a woman's work is never done. And I would just remind you what most people thought women's work really was. In fact, this painting from 1912 by the artist John Sloan is actually called Women's Work, which tells you exactly what he thought women's work should be. But this was the time when lives for women had started significant change. And I'm showing you a cartoon photograph of what happens when a woman starts to think for herself. You can see her here reading the magazine Truth while her poor husband is shamed into doing the laundry and washing the socks. But in fact, by the 1890s, there were articles that started to appear in the newspapers that were called women's work that were actually about art. There was one in the Boston Standard in 1895, and it wasn't devoted to cooking and laundering, but to the School of the Museum of Fine Arts. And for at least that writer, women's work was definitely defined as making art. The idea of women's work was really used with a new intensity to communicate the aspirations of the museum school students. For the anonymous reporter who wrote that article noted that, and I quote, "While the majority of young men students employ their afternoons and evenings in some lucrative manner in order they might have additional money, the young women devote every moment of their time to the study of art, working with indefatigable zeal." The period that we're going to be looking at together coincides with a tremendous shift in the roles of women in American society, from domestic concerns, such as the mother and child image that you see on the left by the Ohio-born painter Lily Martin Spencer. It's called "This Little Piggy Went to Market," and it was painted in 1857. And on the right, a cartoon called "The Weaker Sex." And if you look very carefully, you'll see that Charles Dana Gibson has penciled in a tiny little man underneath that magnifying glass, making a remark on which he thought was the weaker sex. Women had been charged really with domestic concerns, with the physical development of their families, but also with their cultural development. And that's where art could play a dual role. In the late 19th century, mostly after the Civil War, they also took more visible roles. While they had been tremendously active in the abolitionist movement, especially here in Boston, many of these women continued their battle for reform in the context of the suffrage movement. And I'd remind you that this period from the 1870s forward coincides with the founding of many women's colleges, particularly, again, here in New England, Wellesley, Radcliffe, and Wheaton, for example, and also with increased numbers of women professionals in many fields. And I show you here, if I can get my slide to change. A roundup of a lot of women in different fields. At upper left, the astronomer, Maria Mitchell. Just below her with the cap and gown, the economics professor, Emily Balch. The physician, Maria Zakhareva, who founded the New England Hospital for Women and Children. At the bottom in black and white, you see Pauline Agassiz Shaw, who founded the North Bennett Street School and promoted the establishment of kindergarten as a regular thing. Social reform, Mary Hemingway, who was a donor to the School for African Americans at Hampton and a promoter of physical education for women. Annie Fields, who led in literature, music, Amy Beach, and at upper right, of course, the leader in collecting, Isabella Stewart Gardner. So there are many professional women that I think really set the scene for professional women in the field of art and particularly painting. The late 19th century also saw a new fashion for art. It wasn't unusual to see images of women as painters or connoisseurs. As you see here on the left, an illustration from a fashion magazine, Moniteur de la Mode from 1883, or on the right, a wonderful painting by Alfred Stevens called In the Studio in the Metropolitan's collection, where both the painter, the patron, and the model are all women. I don't mean to imply that there were no women artists before the late 19th century. Goodrich on the left, Sarah Goodrich, was a prolific miniaturist in the Boston area in the 1820s and 30s. And I just point out that miniatures were considered an appropriate medium for women. They were small, they were portable, they could be done in the home. Goodrich opened a studio in Boston in 1820. She met Gilbert Stuart and was commissioned eventually to paint a number of prominent New Englanders, including Stuart himself, Daniel Webster, and other luminaries. On the right, you see Harriet Hosmer in a photograph and in her sculpture Sleeping Fawn from 1865 at lower right. Hosmer was the daughter of a Watertown physician who encouraged her physical and mental development. She was said to be able to run faster and shoot straighter than any boy in Watertown. And she went to Rome at the age of 22 and stayed there for the rest of her career, not only for the marble that was available in Italy and the skilled carvers she could hire there, but also very much for the way that art was integral to Italian culture. She also, as an American in Rome, was free from the strictures and conventions of Roman society. As her friend, the sculptor William Wetmore Story remarked, Hattie Hosmer takes a high hand here in Rome and would have the Romans know that a Yankee girl can do anything she pleases, walk alone, ride her horse alone, and laugh at their rules. So I think you can see what was considered restrictive for women, that certainly Hattie Hosmer and many others ignored completely. But it isn't so easy to learn how to become an artist. And maybe we'll get the slide to advance. Most women aspire to undertake a, I'm going to stop sharing and start sharing again in case that helps. Yes, most women aspire to a traditional academic education in the arts, which meant that you started to learn by drawing after casts of antique sculpture. And that's the way most academies of arts began instruction. And casts of antique sculpture were available as early as 1823 at the Athenaeum here in Boston. But when the writer Hannah Adams was admitted to membership in the Athenaeum as a reader in 1827, it was made clear to her that the sculpture gallery was not open to women, it was men only. The first classes in proper classes in art instruction for women came in 1851 at the Boston School of Design. And in 1863, women began to study drawing at the Lowell Institute, where the most influential instructor was William Rimmer, whose drawing of an anatomical drawing you see here on the right. Rimmer was a physician, a sculptor, a painter, a businessman, and a firm believer in art education for women. Well, the problem wasn't teaching women how to draw from casts or from sculpture or by copying drawings. The problem was teaching women how to render the human figure from life. And that was entirely in opposition to conventional standards for ladylike behavior. I'm showing you here again the Rimmer drawing at upper right. On the left, a drawing by Thomas Akins of a woman model at the Pennsylvania Academy who wore a mask to disguise her own identity. And at the lower right, a photograph again by Akins of a male model at that school. The Boston School of Design never came to grips with what to do about nude models. And instead of asking the models to veil themselves, they asked the students to veil themselves so that they couldn't be recognized in public later. We know that Rimmer offered life drawing to his students because a father wrote to complain about it, saying that he was going to withdraw his daughter from Rimmer's classes if, and I quote, a male model was allowed to go about the schoolroom without clothing. So women drawing male models was often equated in the press and in the popular imagination with a loss of virginity, as an angry parent wrote to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in 1882. And again, I quote, "Does it pay for a young lady of a refined, godly household to be urged as the only way of attaining a knowledge of true art to enter a class where every feeling of maidenly delicacy is so violated that no possible art can restore her lost treasure of chaste and delicate thoughts?" Hardly the kinds of words that you would expect in an art class. But I would point out that the women who were studying in these classes wrote about their experiences in the popular press and made it clear that their business was study, that it wasn't about sex, and that the students, men and women both, were simply painters. The first real classes for women in painting, as opposed to drawing, were offered by William Morris Hunt here in Boston in 1868. And you see Hunt's self-portrait from 1866 on the left, and on the right, Hunt at the very center in one of his classes. Hunt was Boston's leading painter with a very magnetic presence and an impeccable social stature, and he dominated Boston's artistic life for well over 2 decades. The men, of course, complained that Hunt offered to schoolgirls what was meant for mankind. But I would just point out that it was Hunt who had a profound impact on women's artistic education, taking their professional aspirations seriously and remarking that if he had to choose the 5 most talented young artists in Boston, he would choose all women. One of his students, Lizzie Bartol, said, "We were taught as any students in school. We were criticized as roughly, made to work as strenuously, and praised as frankly as the men. Good work," she said, "is neither masculine nor feminine." So it was really almost more than learning how to paint. It was Hunt's belief in women's capability to be professional artists that had the biggest effect. It was an affirmation of their aspirations, and that sense of entitlement lasted well beyond the turn of the century, because Hunt's students then became role models and mentors for younger women with artistic aspirations. Here is one of Hunt's students. These are both works by Sarah Wyman Whitman, Roses on the left from 1879 and View of Niagara Falls on the right from 1891. Whitman was one of Hunt's most talented pupils. She was wealthy, socially secure, married to a prosperous Boston wool merchant who mostly let her live her own life. And she was very much secure in her position by the time she entered Hunt's class in the late 1860s. The small still life that you see on the left, just a handful of roses hanging before a stucco wall, is inscribed at the bottom, Souvenir de Villiers-le-Bel. And by that inscription, we know that the painting is an homage to the French painter Thomas Couture, whose studio was at Villiers-le-Bel, and with whom Whitman studied on Hunt's recommendation. So you can see he opened doorways for these women to study with some of the best of his peers. On the right, her pastel of Niagara Falls is a place she called her high altar, and she found divine beauty in its swirling mists, here rendered in very rough layers of pastel. But Whitman turned her attentions in other directions as well. She was an extremely talented designer and became one of publisher Houghton Mifflin's most accomplished designers, producing about 150 to 200 beautiful book covers like the Thoreau Cape Cod that you see on the right from 1896. She also operated her own glass studio in Boston called the Lily Glass Works, which was on Boylston Street. And I'm showing you here on the left her memorial window to Phillips Brooks, which is in the chapter house at Trinity Church. You won't be surprised to know that Whitman would be one of the founding members of the Boston Society of Arts and Crafts, the oldest such organization in the United States, founded in 1897. But you might not know that 50% of the society's members were women. 3 days before the opening of their inaugural exhibition at the Society of Arts and Crafts, the Springfield newspaper published a long article entitled Women of Talent, Their Work in Industrial Arts. And it's not only interesting for its description of Whitman as an artist, but also, again, for its enthusiasm for the work of women. And this interest in the arts and crafts movement led many, many women to unprecedented opportunity, often in new media. And I would just point out that it's really in the 20th century that the arts in which these women often excelled, in design, in decoration, in needlework, in pottery, etc., were devalued again. At the time of the arts and crafts movement, these fields were celebrated as being equal to the arts of sculpture and painting. So within the arts and crafts movement, especially with its sort of aura of social reform, women were able to justify their artistic activities, separating their interest in art from sort of business and instead emphasizing its relationship to charity. I'm showing you a couple of works, arts and crafts produced works. At the top, two pieces from the Paul Revere pottery, a chrysanthemum vase at upper right, designed by Ida Goldstein. And at the left, a piece of nursery ware. You can see little piggies running around that plate. The Saturday Evening Girls Club was a training ground for immigrant Jewish and Italian women in the North End to learn a craft that they could use for income. and it made some of the most beautiful arts and crafts pottery that there is. I'm also showing you a poster for Julia Ward Howe's book, Is Polite Society Polite?, which was designed by Ethel Reed, one of the most interesting Art Nouveau designers active in Boston in the 1890s. And at the right, a photograph by Sarah Choate Sears of her daughter Helen. You might recognize her from Sargent's portrait in the MFA collection. But Sarah Sears was a very accomplished pictorialist photographer, a member of the group The Linked Ring, one of the most prestigious photography groups. And she exhibited widely, not only in the United States, but also in London and in Paris. So these new fields, the ceramics of the arts and crafts movement, posters, photography, these didn't have a long history of artistic accomplishment. And in consequence, women were able to make great strides in those areas. I'm showing you on the left Sargent's portrait of Sarah Choate Sears, which unfortunately does not belong to the MFA. It belongs to the MFA-H. It is in Houston. And on the right, Isabella Stewart Gardner, also by Sargent. And I just show them to you briefly to remind you that the other way in which women were actively and successfully involved in the arts was as collectors, both of these women amassing important collections of both modern and historic art. Obviously, Mrs. Gardner's collection still intact in her palace in the Fenway. Sarah Sears's collection, which consisted of Monet and Manet and all kinds of interesting things dispersed by sale. But despite the tremendous success of women in the decorative arts and in collecting and in other fields more typically associated with women, there were other women who wanted to create art in the traditionally masculine arena of oil painting. And I'm showing you here Ellen Day Hale's self-portrait from 1885. It's been used on the covers of any number of feminist art histories and other kinds of books, so you might recognize it. Hale was one of the most accomplished pupils of William Morris Hunt, and she continued her studies in Paris. She was the only daughter of the well-known minister and abolitionist Edward Everett Hale. Some of you may remember reading Hale's The Man Without a Country when you were in grade school. This was also a family of very strong women. Hale's great aunts included Harriet Beecher Stowe, the reformer Catherine Beecher. She was a cousin of Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who wrote The Yellow Wallpaper, which is now considered a feminist tract. She studied art, as I said, with Hunt and also with her aunt, Susan Hale, who was a writer and a watercolorist. And she lived in Europe in the early 1880s, sending home articles for the Boston Traveler about the art world in Paris. Well, Hale, like so many of aspiring American artists, did go to Paris in the late 19th century. But I want to remind you that the situation in Europe wasn't really any better for women than it was in the United States. Women were not allowed to study life drawing at the Royal Academy in London until 1893, and they were not admitted at all to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris until 1897. Instead, they worked at independent art academies like Julian's Academy, which was especially recommended for women. They charged women twice as much as they charged their male students, but nevertheless, it was a real proper artistic education. Or they followed the guides like May Alcott, yes, Louisa May Alcott's sister, May Alcott Nieriker's 1879 book, Studying Art Abroad and How to Do It Cheaply. So Hale's self-portrait was at least begun in Paris, and I think it shows very much her professional determination. And when it was shown in Boston 2 years later, a local critic remarked, "She displays a man's strength." It's kind of the ultimate compliment. But I would say that despite her strength as a painter and her determination as a painter, Her life as a woman really revolved around family exigencies. And in 1904, Ellen Hale moved to Washington, D.C., where she acted as her father's hostess during his time as chaplain of the US Senate. She avoided a conventional marriage and its complications. She lived in what was called a Boston marriage with another woman artist, Gabrielle DeVoe Clements. But even so, her niece, the writer Nancy Hale, recalled that Ellen Hale's middle years were, quote, given up to looking after a semi-invalid mother and a famous, sought-after, impractical, extrovert father. Aunt Nellie was sorely needed to keep house, to be hostess, and to fend the circling harpies off of him and the well-intentioned parishioners off of her. I used to fly into a rage when my mother suggested that it must have been wonderful to have such a devoted daughter. But I want to remind you that a woman of Ellen Hale's generation typically did not rail against her fate. She did what was expected of her, as even Mary Cassatt had done. And she devoted herself part of the time, if not more of part of her time, to the needs of her family. But Hale, like Cassatt, never stopped painting. Sorry for these gaps. I'm going to go out and in again. It seems to be the way to do this. There we go. Another Hunt student who studied abroad was Elizabeth Boot, the daughter of a socially prominent Boot Boston family, the Boots of Boots Mills. She spent a good part of her early life in Italy. They were friends with Henry James, who called her the incomparable Lizzie. This is her view of Narcissus on the Roman Campagna from the 1870s. If you look carefully on the horizon, you can see a little lump. That is the dome of St. Peter's. Lizzie Boot returned to Boston in 1865. She studied with Hunt, and then she went back to Europe, studying with Thomas Couture, as Whitman had done, and spending the winters in Rome. But she exhibited her work in Boston and New York and had a solo show here in Boston in 1884. In the late 1870s, she met the painter Frank Duveneck, who you see here with her on the left. Duveneck was teaching in Boston, and they had an on-again, off-again romance. Her father completely disapproved of this bohemian artist who had captivated his daughter, but she persisted. She married Frank Duveneck in Paris in March of 1886. And that brings us to consider a whole other range of issues that women artists had to deal with. Harriet Hosmer, the sculptor I showed you earlier, had written that she herself was a faithful worshiper of celibacy, adding, an artist has no business to marry. For a man, it may be well enough, but for a woman on whom matrimonial duties and cares weigh more heavily, it is a moral wrong. Well, when Lizzie and Frank got married, they listed both of themselves on the marriage register as artists, and they returned to Florence, where they had a son in December of 1886, when Frank Duveneck, painted the portrait of Lizzie that you see on the right. Lizzie wrote in her correspondence that it was difficult for her to work and to look after the needs of her household, and she stopped painting very much. They moved back to Paris. She exhibited one watercolor at the Paris Salon in March of 1888, and she died of pneumonia a week later. Henry James wrote to her father that he felt that Lizzie had been spared a life of, and I quote, perpetual struggle and disappointment. She's often best known now, not by her own work, but by this amazing tomb that Frank Duveneck carved for her, which you can see at lower right in the Allori Cemetery in Florence. It's the Protestant cemetery of Florence, but there he made marble versions of it for both the MFA and the Met. in Cincinnati. So you may be familiar with this from the MFA's own collection. It's a remarkably beautiful image of, I think, exquisite tenderness and sadness. Well, not everybody had the resources and the resolve to study abroad. It was much harder for women to do. It was harder to travel alone, to stay in cheap lodgings alone, and simply to live life abroad as a single woman. So when the art schools were started to be founded in the United States in the last third of the 19th century, it was incredibly important for women. The Massachusetts Normal Art School, which is today the Mass College of Art and Design, and the School of the Museum of Fine Arts were both founded in 1870, and many, many women studied there. I'm showing you a cartoon from the student paper of the SMFA, the museum school, and it says, "'Twas a day in bright October when two students blithe and gay went to seek a little studio, for they'd left the MFA. Would you like to see the studio?" said the agent with a grin. "Just go up to the very top and then you go right in." The way up to that studio was by a winding stair, but when they reached the very top, they sat down in despair. "Oh, boys can off to Paris go, great artists for to be. But girls, alas, must stay at home and feel like you and me." So here's the original MFA building, which was in Copley Square. The museum opened in 1877 and the art classes began in January. The museum opened in 76. The art classes started in January 1877 in this building. And 80 students applied to the first the class, including several women. And you see some of them here at left gathered around a cast of the Venus de Milo. Equal opportunities were offered to women from the very beginning, although in segregated facilities. And again, the controversy was whether or not drawing from life should be offered, first of all, to anybody, but especially to women. And women were excluded from the very first life classes at the museum school, but the prohibition lasted only for a year when separate life classes for women were established, such as the one that you see on the right. But whatever place a woman artist was in, it was a difficult decision to pursue art as a profession rather than a diversion. If a woman worked in any field, she was not expected to marry. And if she did, she was expected to leave her profession and devote herself to her family. I'm showing you as an illustration a painting by a woman artist named Anna Lee Merritt, an American woman artist, called "Love Locked Out." It seems a fitting symbol for this moment when professional women were expected to remain single. And in fact, Merritt herself noted that some of the difficulties facing women painters, writing about how much more their domestic responsibilities were falling on women, especially wives, than they were on the men, that no one would expect the men to do it, whereas the women were really at the beck and call, as she put it, of affections or duties or trivial domestic cares. And then in 1912, something that is no longer true, she said, "The chief obstacle to a woman's success is that she can never have a wife." Even when considering marriage, decisions were not always so easy. I'm showing you on the right a self-portrait by Lillian Westcott Hale, and on the left, a self-portrait by her husband, Philip. The summer after her first year of studies at the museum school, Lillian Hale met and fell in love with Philip Hale. They didn't study together. She had skipped ahead out of his class. And he joked that he would have to join the advanced classes at the school in order to keep company with her. And Lillian wrote to her sister, who said back to her, "Mr. Hale seems like a man congenial in his taste to yours, and I don't see why, loving and marrying him, you would break your vow of everlasting faithfulness to your work." This is the kind of vow that women made to themselves in order to keep professional careers. But Philip Hale encouraged his wife. He promoted her career. And in fact, in the end, she was much more popular and prolific than he was. They married in 1902. And when that happened, Lillian Hale, again, whose work you see on the right in a painting called The Convalescent from 1906, she became the wife to one painter, Philip Hale, and the sister-in-law to Ellen Day Hale. So there was a very supportive family community on which she could depend for the support of her work. And indeed, it's to Ellen Hale that a lot of her letters about art issues are directed. Lillian and Philip took studios in the Fenway Studio Building when it opened in Boston in 1905. Notably, they did not share a studio. They each had their own room. Lillian made her career on exquisite charcoal drawings like these two, both of them in the MFA collection. I would just note that the one on your right is probably something you have never seen. It walked in pretty much off the street last year and was given to the MFA, and we're thrilled to have it. These are both from about 1907, use of the same model, Rose Zeffler. So her devastatingly beautiful drawings were exhibited as independent works of art and related paintings as well. The Boston Transcript, in fact, remarked that Hale and Elizabeth Paxton, whose work you see on the left, were two of the best painters in Boston, and that their husbands, Philip Hale and William Paxton, whose work you see on the right, could learn a thing or two from their wives. Something you hear very often. But the combination of the groundbreaking achievements of the earlier generation of women artists, plus the ability to get formally trained in the fine arts, plus the supportive community they found in Boston, made for a remarkable group of women artists who achieved success. Elizabeth Oakey, who married William Paxton, studied at a different art school in Boston, the Cowles Art School. They married in 1899. And you see that her work relates to his in that it's interiors like his new necklace, but it's very much obviously a woman's bedroom with the shoes and the women's garments strewn across the bed. But the other thing that cropped up when women artists married was the idea that in this age before birth control, you were probably going to have children. And even the couple's artist friends of the Hales made it very clear that the baby was going to be Lillian's job. This is a cartoon that was sent to the Hales. It shows Philip Hale painting wildly with a squalling baby held under his arm, while a half-nude model dances in the background. And the caption at the top says, "Lillian better not leave you to mind the baby." So Lillian minded the baby herself, and she made exquisite drawings of her daughter Nancy, this one from 1908, shortly after her birth, where baby Nancy becomes one of the floral blossoms that cover this entire composition. Nancy continued to be a model for Lillian Hale throughout her life. But I wanted to show you how these women artists sort of move from one to the other. On the left, you see Lillian Hale's Home Lessons from 1919, a painting now in the Phillips collection. And on the right, Gretchen Rogers' Woman in a Fur Hat from 1915 at the MFA. So Lillian has the baby. She gives up her studio in the Fenway Studio Building, and she moves with her family to Dedham, and she keeps a studio in her house in Dedham in 1909. And what happens to her Fenway studio? Gretchen Rogers, whose work you see on the right, takes it over. So there is this sort of family tree of women artists supporting women artists. Both of these paintings are very much in keeping with the aesthetics of the Boston School, which used Vermeer and his interest in form and light, his lack of anecdote, his concentration on composition and design rather than on narrative as a model for contemporary art. And in fact, Philip Hale had published the first modern monograph on Vermeer in 1913. So much so that his daughter Nancy remarked that she thought Vermeer was a friend of her father's. Gretchen Rogers studied with Tarbell and Benson and Hale at the museum school. This is her self-portrait, and I think you'll recognize that it too bears a resemblance to one of the admired paintings by Vermeer. Rogers on the right shows herself as a woman artist who sort of typifies the Bostonian ideal of feminine beauty, academic intelligence, and a certain detached modesty. It updates the traditions that were admired in old master painting, but it certainly refers to them completely. Here is Tarbell's painting, again, referring to the old masters and making them modern. I want to show it to you to show how much these women artists in Boston were very much in keeping with the works of their male colleagues. So it's not a matter of having a distinctive woman's style, but of competing on a level playing ground with the men. But even though most of these women were progressive in their desire to be accepted as men's equals in terms of their painting talent, they didn't necessarily challenge all of the social conventions of their day. And a lot of them made subjects that were appropriate for women. Gretchen Rogers painting still lifes at upper left, Lillian Hale painting children at lower left. And I would just remind you that even Mary Cassatt did the same thing with her many images of mothers and children, such as the beautiful one you see on the right, which was in a Boston collection, belonged to Sarah Cho Sears. And that idea of being professional and putting yourself forward professionally while maintaining a social life that was more in keeping with expectations was not unique to the art world. And I'm showing you here a photograph of Inez Milholland, who was a leading suffragette. But when she was pictured for Good Housekeeping magazine in 1912, she took on the role of Cornelia, the Roman woman who said that her most precious treasure was her children. So these ideas about promoting the traditional roles of women were sort of used in a way to keep people from feeling that their professional accomplishments had just led to all kinds of societal upheaval. The issues regarding appropriate subjects for women were not unique to painting. It was a battle fought in sculpture as well. Women artists in the United States, like Bashka Peth, whose Boston Public Garden fountain you see on the left, or Anna von Hyatt, whose Young Diana from the MFA you see on the right. These women were given commissions most often for garden sculpture or for small tabletop sculptures, but very rarely were they given commissions for heroic public monuments. It happened once when the Boston Art Commission wanted to memorialize Senator Charles Sumner, who you see here in a photograph in black and white at lower right. There was an anonymous competition for it. Anne Whitney, who you see in the photograph at left, won that competition. And when they found out that she was a woman, they took away the commission and they gave it to Thomas Ball, a male sculptor, whose image of Sumner you see at the center as it now appears in the Boston Public Garden. At the upper right, you see Whitney's original Sumner, which she eventually was able to make and is now sitting in the middle of Harvard Square. As Whitney put it in her own words, "It will take more than a Boston Art Commission to quench me."
Excuse the interruption. I beg your pardon. Would participants who are unmuted kindly mute their telephones or computers?
Sorry, my slides are skipping ahead without me. By the 1910s, I want to say that women artists were plentiful enough and confident enough to choose independent artistic styles. And they didn't necessarily band together to subvert their own ideas about artistic expression in favor of a single aesthetic any longer. On the left, you see Margaret Richardson's Self-Portrait, a motion picture from 1912. Wonderful Boston artist, this painting, alas, in Philadelphia and not in Boston. And on the right, Polly Thayer's Self-Portrait from 1927. Richardson studied at the Massachusetts Normal School and the MFA school. She had a lot of success earlier in her career, and this painting was immediately purchased by the Pennsylvania Academy the year that it was exhibited there in their annual exhibition. She presents herself as literally and figuratively a woman on the move and a working woman with two brushes in her hands. Similarly, Polly Thayer, who also studied at the MFA school, mastered a traditional academic style, but she shows herself as a modern woman with her hair cut in the new 1920s bob, and she's holding that brush as if she's about to use it. Thank you very much. So again, this idea of activity and motion. And despite Boston's general love for the beautiful, modern ideas do make inroads here. If I can get my slide, here we go. These are both also by Polly Thayer. 10 years later, from the 1930s, her portrait of May Sarton from 1936 on the left in the Foggs collection, and on the right, a still life of cabbages in the MFA's collection. So women artists like Thayer found room for artistic growth, found their way to a more modern kind of expression. And I want to point out that women artists were equally active in the modern movement. This is a still life by Sarah Choate Sears of lilies, a pastel, brilliant colors, flattened composition, overall design. Again, it's that traditional subject of a floral still life, but it is shown in a new way. And Roberts, too, Elizabeth Wentworth Roberts, develops a style that really moves away from her early and somewhat more conventional images, beautiful as they are. I'm showing you here two very early ones of a woman in Brittany from 1889, and on the right, a landscape in Egypt from the early 1900s, both in the Concord collection. And they are incredibly beautiful, but she moves on from this style towards something that's a little more 20th century in feeling, with these beautiful images of beaches, figures on the sand at the left, or figures on the sand in Annisquam from 1915 at the lower right. She became much more interested in the abstract qualities of the overall design, in the use of empty space, and also in more personalized and expressive brushstrokes and richer colors. She might have explored this kind of modernism in Ogunquit, where there was a school that was led by the Boston painter Charles Woodbury, whose beach scene you see here at the top. And you see Roberts's view of fish houses in Ogunquit at the bottom. So she's working in this atmosphere where a sort of conservative modernism was taking shape. I want to point out one other thing to you in the Charles Woodbury painting. You can see a big orange square at the upper center. That is a truck that says Orange Crush on it. And to its left, you'll see a whole parking lot full of cars. And that is very much a part of the new modern woman, because these women, like Roberts at the upper left, like Gertrude Fisk, who's a Ogunquit scene you see at upper right, or even, dare I say, like Georgia O'Keeffe, who you see in the photograph at the bottom. All of them traveled, all of them often behind the wheels of their own cars. So the old conventional wisdom about women and physical fitness that had really changed women's lives as they became more active, more independent, and more able to travel on their own. It was well within a new woman's power to drive the car, take the painting supplies along, and go out on the road. I'm showing you the Gertrude Fisk of Ogunquit because I want to close with Gertrude Fisk, who to me is so much about the new century. You see her self-portrait here on the left from 1922, and two of her landscapes on the right, a view of Wells Beach with its cascade of telephone poles at the upper right, and at the lower right, a view of the amusement park at Revere Beach. So to me, Fisk speaks so much about this new century, about navigating the conventions of society and the fierce independence and devotion that she had to her art. She explored new subjects, and I think her work is particularly strong, not pretty, not ladylike, but forceful and unconventional with its color juxtapositions. And I'm going to close by showing you the entrance to Gertrude Fisk's own studio, which was on a floor above the garage that housed her own Model A. And I think you can see that the sign to the studio says, "No trespassing, G. Fisk." And I think that's really the key, that Boston women took a major place in the arts, and that all they really needed was to have studios of their own. Thank you so much. I know we have some questions coming, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, Erica, maybe we can give people a couple moments to add some questions to the chat if they have any. We will keep an eye out and read them out. Let me just go back here and see if we have any coming in. Yeah, I'm not seeing any questions, so maybe folks are
You believed everything I said.
Here's one. Someone asks, what was an influence of Tarbell?
So Edmund Tarbell was the leading instructor of painting at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts, and a tremendous influence on all the painters who came through that particular school and system. He was considered the leading artist in Boston. And what I like about Tarbell is actually that he was incredibly supportive to women artists and encouraged them and supported their efforts to become professional. So he was, I will say, considered to be someone who stuck with tradition. He was not fond of the modern developments like Cubism and so on that were starting to come in to the United States in the early 20th century. And I think Tarbell was really shaped by the idea that art should be beautiful, and that if you knew how to draw beautiful things, that's what you should do. And I think he felt very, I want to say, I guess I'll use a strong word and say, I think he was sort of disgusted at the idea that a modern painter had the capability to draw something beautiful and chose not to. He didn't find them beautiful at all. So some people feel that Tarbell kept Boston back as an art center, and other people feel that he was holding the line to create art that was in the traditions of art of the past.
One question, a comment?
Hi, go ahead.
Yeah, and among other famous husband and wife trios, pairs, the Zareks, they are out of Georgetown, Maine, and Marguerite Zorek was another quite advanced artist, and he was a sculptor and ended up being a sculptor. But that's an example of her work is probably more famous than his, at least as far as paintings are concerned, where there are whimsical depictions of country life in Maine and elsewhere. And also Dove, Arthur Dove, and his wife, I believe it was
Helen Tor. Helen
Yeah.
Tor.
Tor, who did wonderful things in his image often. But if you see her, she's every bit as likable and advanced as he was.
Yeah.
So there's another couple of examples. Couples, whether women became quite well known.
Yeah, there are many, many of them. The Alberses, Annie and Joseph Albers. Something just went out of my head. The Ameses, Ray and Charles Ames. There are many, many husband and wife pairs. Something that we had explored a little bit in a show we did in 2019 called Women Take the Floor. There were a number of artist couples in that. The MFA even owns a Zorak that he painted one side of it and she painted the other. So you can't get much more together than that.
Okay, Erica, they're coming in quick now. So I think.
Okay, you read and I'll do my best.
Yeah, we'll get to as many as we can. But so someone asked, what was the influence of Japanese art on the School of Artists?
Very good question. There's a long history of interest in Japan and Boston, as many of you no doubt know. And in fact, Boston is often given either the credit or the blame for opening Japan to the West with Perry's, Commodore Perry's journey there. There was a great fascination for Japanese art throughout Europe and the United States in the late 19th century. It was sold, it was marketed by the Japanese at world's fairs. The 1876 exhibition in Philadelphia had a big Japanese pavilion, for example, and it was very much sought after. And there were stores here in Boston and Salem where you could buy Japanese art. And people were fascinated both with it and also with the compositional strategies that Japanese printmakers in particular used, their way of designing the surface pattern of a composition. And painters like Arthur Wesley Dow made a book called Composition, examining Japanese methods of making pictures. And that too was tremendously influential in spreading the design sensibilities of Japanese art further and further afield. It's a critical part of art both in Europe and in the United States in the late 19th, early 20th centuries.
I'm going to keep moving so we can get through as many of these as possible. So how strong a requirement was, sorry, I think the wording, I'm going to get tripped up here. How strong a requirement was independent or married wealth in these artists' ability to pursue art?
Well, no artist really wants to aspire to starve in a garret. So, it's interesting to see how people who are really wanting to be artists make a living. Obviously, you have to have a certain amount of income or you're not going to be able to travel to Europe and enroll in one of these academies. It's just, it's a kind of income gap that we're still living with. But at the same time, a lot of artists became portraitists because that was a reliable way to make a career. They became illustrators because that was a reliable way to have income. So you could earn a living as an artist. It wasn't easy. It's still not easy. So they often taught. William Merritt Chase taught. Tarbell taught. That provided a reliable income. Sargent made his living on portraits. So you see that over and over. Some artists, Elizabeth Bouguereau, for example, talks about how she painted pot boilers for the tourists. So there were ways to earn your own living, but I will not deny that it took a certain amount wealth or stamina to start out in a field that did not guarantee you a living wage.
I'm going to dovetail two questions together because they're related. Were there Afro-American female artists in Boston as well? And what is known about art during this period done by women of color?
Very, very good question. The answer is we're still learning about that. Meta Warwick Fuller is the best known of the late 19th century artists of color. She was a sculptor, lived in Framingham, studied even with Rodin in Paris, did some remarkable work. A lot of it is owned by the Danforth Museum in Framingham. Not so much of it was cast during her lifetime. This is another expense issue, casting your, artists, sculptors usually make a smaller version of their work in clay or in plaster. But to have it either carved in marble or especially cast in bronze was expensive. And so some artists who were not well-to-do without a commission weren't able to do that. A lot of Fuller's work was cast later. There's a wonderful example of it in the South End in the Emancipation Monument that's in a small square near Appleton and Canton Streets in the South End. Of painters, the best known is Lois Mailou Jones, who studied at the SMFA school. She's a little bit later, active starting in the 1920s and active actually well into the 70s. I forget when she died.
So there was a question kind of about art institutions, and maybe you have some information on this. So how do we account for the blossoming of institutional support for the arts during this period? The founding of the Met, the ICA, MassArt, and more.
Well, there's this wonderful quote by John Adams, who, when the government is being founded says, I fight so that my children can be merchants and my children are merchants so that their children can be artists. It's something that comes, I think, with a stability of a country to start establishing institutions. But after the Civil War, the United States is really keen to catch up on a world stage, and it's a time of colonial activity. It's a time of institutional activity. It's a time when there's enough stability to start forming colleges and art schools and that sort of thing. And it really just takes that long. And they see what's going on in Europe. They see these academies that everybody's taking off to, and they say, well, why does everybody have to go abroad? We should have that here in America. There are earlier ones. The National Academy of Design in New York and the Pennsylvania Academy are both earlier 19th century institutions. So there were some, but not very many.
Well, I think there are some other questions, but we're running pretty over time. So I think we're going to close it there so that we can all get some dinner or get some whatever we need to get in for the rest of the evening. So I'm going to turn it back over to Kate James, who will give us a quick closing message. And thank you so much, Erica, for being with us. It's been fabulous.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marissa. And thank you, Erica. This was fascinating for me. I do have one question though. Did women get jobs as teachers at any of these art colleges? Or was it all men teaching?
There were some women teachers.
Oh, okay.
Not so many, but some.
All right. Great. Well, I'm not going to keep anybody. I want to just thank everyone for coming tonight, and please come by Concord Art to see the exhibit we have up. I think you saw maybe 3 of the paintings that are in the show, and everybody is incredibly amazed by what we have and what is in our collection. So we really look forward to seeing you. And Erica, we wish you well. We know you have another lecture this week and shows coming up. And so thank you so much for giving us your time. Everybody here really appreciated it. And hopefully we can catch up with you again soon. So
With
thank you.
pleasure. Thank
Okay.
you so
Good night,
much. It's been a
everybody, and
joy to
take
see
care.
you all.